The grumpy grandpa swore he hated cats, until the orange one slept on his chest after his stroke. George Patterson was, to put it mildly, a creature of habit. He was 73, a retired carpenter with hands that still bore the calluses of a lifetime spent working with wood, and a face etched with the deep lines of a man who preferred scowling to smiling. He lived in the same modest, two-story house in the quiet suburbs of Phoenix, Arizona, that he'd shared with his wife, Margaret, for over 50 years. His days followed a predictable rhythm. Morning coffee on the porch, tinkering in his workshop, watching the news, and complaining about the state of the world. And, most emphatically, George hated cats. It wasn't a mild dislike. It was a deep-seated, unwavering aversion. He'd never understood the appeal of the creatures. Furry freeloaders, he'd call them, slinking around, shedding everywhere, demanding attention. His pronouncements on the subject were legendary within the family, a running joke that everyone knew to tread lightly around. Margaret, his wife of 5 decades, was his opposite in many ways. Gentle, patient, and endlessly kind. She loved all creatures, great and small. She'd often tried to soften George's stance on cats, pointing out their grace, their independence, their soothing purrs. But he remained unmoved, his opinion solidified by years of stubborn adherence. Their 2 adult children, David and Carol, lived nearby with their respective families. The grandchildren, 4 in total, ranging in age from 5 to 12, were the light of George's life, even if he rarely showed it in a conventional way. He'd grumble about their noise, their mess, their endless energy, but his eyes would twinkle with a hidden affection when they were around. And, of course, the grandchildren loved cats. Visits to Grandma and Grandpa's house were often punctuated by attempts to sneak a stray cat into the house, or pleas to adopt a kitten from the local shelter. These requests were always met with a resounding "no" from George, delivered in a voice that could curdle milk. He'd launch into one of his anti-cat tirades, much to Margaret's quiet dismay and the grandchildren's suppressed giggles. "They're sneaky," he'd declare, waving his hands emphatically. "They'll scratch your furniture, they'll cough up hairballs on your rug, and they'll expect you to wait on them hand and foot. No, sir. No cats in this house. Not while I'm alive." Despite the recurring cat-related conflicts, the family was close-knit. They gathered for Sunday dinners, celebrated holidays together, and supported each other through thick and thin. George, despite his gruff exterior, was the bedrock of the family, a man of strong principles and unwavering loyalty. One warm evening in late May, as George was sitting on the porch swing, watching the sunset paint the Arizona sky in shades of orange and purple, he felt a sudden, sharp pain in his head. He reached up, his hand trembling, and his vision blurred. He tried to call out to Margaret, but his words came out slurred, unintelligible. He felt a strange weakness in his left side, a terrifying numbness that spread quickly through his body. He slumped back against the swing, his eyes wide with fear, the vibrant colors of the sunset fading into a hazy gray. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that something was terribly wrong. He tried to focus, but the words won't come out clearly. Part 2, the stroke. The world swam back into focus through a distorted lens. George found himself lying in a sterile white room, the beeping of machines a constant, intrusive presence. He tried to move, but his left side was unresponsive, a dead weight. Panic clawed at his throat, but he couldn't scream. Margaret's face, etched with worry and exhaustion, hovered above him. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her voice trembling as she spoke. "George? George, can you hear me? You've had a stroke, dear. You're in the hospital." The words barely registered. Stroke. Hospital. He tried to speak, to ask what had happened, but his tongue felt thick and clumsy, his mouth refusing to cooperate. Only a garbled sound escaped his lips. The next few days were a blur of doctors, nurses, tests, and procedures. David and Carol were constantly by his side, their faces a mixture of fear and forced optimism. The grandchildren sent hand-drawn cards, covered in glitter and misspelled words, their innocent messages of love a poignant contrast to the sterile reality of the hospital room. The doctor, a young woman with a kind but serious demeanor, explained the situation to the family. George had suffered a significant stroke, affecting the right side of his brain. He was lucky to be alive, but the damage was substantial. He had left-side paralysis and aphasia, a condition that impaired his ability to speak and understand language. The recovery will be long and challenging, the doctor said, her voice measured. He'll need extensive physical therapy, speech therapy, and ongoing medical care. There's no guarantee of a full recovery, but with hard work and support, he can regain some function. The family listened in stunned silence, absorbing the weight of the prognosis. Margaret, her hand tightly clasped in George's unresponsive one, nodded slowly, her eyes filled with a quiet determination. "We'll do whatever it takes," she said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. "We'll bring him home, and we'll help him get better." After 2 weeks in the hospital, George was discharged. The house, once his familiar sanctuary, now felt like a foreign land. The stairs were an insurmountable obstacle, the doorways too narrow for his wheelchair. The silence, once a welcome respite from the world's noise, now pressed down on him, a suffocating reminder of his inability to communicate. Returning home feels like a daunting task. Part 3, Silent Days. The first few weeks at home were the hardest. George, a man who had always prided himself on his independence and self-sufficiency, was now entirely reliant on others. He couldn't dress himself, bathe himself, or even feed himself. The frustration was immense, a burning rage that simmered beneath the surface of his enforced silence. Margaret, his tireless caregiver, bore the brunt of his frustration. She patiently spoon-fed him, helped him with his exercises, and interpreted his garbled attempts at communication. She never complained, never wavered in her support. But George saw the exhaustion in her eyes, the strain in her smile. The family visited often, but the interactions were strained. David and Carol tried to be cheerful, to engage George in conversation, but their efforts often fell flat. The grandchildren, once eager to climb on Grandpa's lap and tell him about their day, were now hesitant, unsure how to interact with their silent, immobile grandfather. The absence of George's usual grumbling about cats was perhaps the most telling sign of his condition. The family, accustomed to his anti-cat pronouncements, found the silence on the subject unsettling. It was as if a fundamental part of George had been erased, leaving behind a hollow shell. George spent most of his days sitting in his wheelchair by the living room window, staring out at the world. He watched the birds flitting in the trees, the cars driving by, the neighbors going about their daily lives. He felt like a prisoner in his own body, trapped in a silent world, cut off from everything he had once known and loved. The anger and resentment simmered, threatening to consume him. He hated his helplessness, his dependence, the pity he saw in the eyes of his loved ones. He longed to shout, to scream, to express the turmoil that raged within him, but the words wouldn't come. He felt utterly, desperately alone. Part 4. The Unexpected Visitor. The Pattersons' next-door neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, was an elderly widow who lived alone with her orange cat, a handsome, ginger Tom named Sonny. Sonny was a friendly, outgoing cat, known for his leisurely strolls through the neighborhood and his habit of befriending anyone who crossed his path. He'd often been seen in the Pattersons' yard, sunning himself on the porch or chasing butterflies in the garden. George, in his pre-stroke days, would shoo him away with a gruff, "Get out of here, you mangy furball." But Sonny, unfazed by George's hostility, would simply blink his golden eyes and continue on his way. After George's stroke, Sonny's visits to the yard continued. He'd sit on the fence, watching George through the window, his tail twitching slowly. Margaret, noticing his presence, would often leave a small bowl of water out for him, a gesture of neighborly kindness. One warm afternoon, about a month after George had returned home, one of the grandchildren, 8-year-old Lily, had been visiting. She'd been playing in the living room, drawing pictures for her grandfather, when she'd accidentally left the window slightly ajar. Later that afternoon, as George sat in his usual spot by the window, he saw a flash of orange fur. Sonny, emboldened by the open invitation, slipped through the gap and entered the house. George watched him, his heart rate quickening. He wanted to shout, to wave his arms, to scare the cat away, but he couldn't. He was trapped, a helpless observer in his own home. Sonny, seemingly oblivious to George's distress, padded silently across the room. He paused at the foot of the wheelchair, his golden eyes studying George intently. Then, with a graceful leap, he landed on the armrest. George tensed, his body rigid with apprehension. He expected the cat to jump down, to run away, to do anything but what he did next. Sonny, with a soft purr rumbling in his chest, stepped onto George's lap, circled once, and then carefully settled himself down, resting his weight squarely on George's chest. The warmth of the cat's body, the gentle pressure against his chest, the rhythmic vibration of his purr. It was all unexpected, overwhelming. George stared at the cat, his eyes wide with surprise. And then, for the first time in weeks, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. Part 5. A flicker of hope. The sensation of the cat on his chest was surprising, not unpleasant, not entirely. George, the lifelong cat hater, found himself strangely comforted by the warm weight, the steady purr, the soft fur against his skin. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected anything. His eyes, usually clouded with frustration and anger, softened slightly. The rigid tension in his body began to ease. He looked down at Sonny, the orange cat who had defied his lifelong aversion, and a flicker of something akin to curiosity sparked within him. Margaret, who had been in the kitchen preparing dinner, heard the change in George's breathing. She rushed into the living room, expecting to find him in distress. What she saw stopped her in her tracks. George, her gruff, cat-hating husband, was sitting in his wheelchair, an orange cat nestled comfortably on his chest, and the faintest trace of a smile on his lips. She stood there for a moment, speechless, her hand over her mouth. She'd seen that smile, or a variation of it, so rarely in the past weeks. The stroke had stolen so much from George, had robbed him of his voice, his mobility, his very essence. But here, in this unexpected scene, was a glimmer of the man she loved. Sonny, sensing her presence, looked up and blinked his golden eyes, as if acknowledging her surprise. He continued to purr, his body vibrating gently against George's chest. Margaret slowly approached, her heart pounding with a mixture of disbelief and cautious hope. "George," she whispered, her voice trembling. He turned his head, his eyes meeting hers. The smile widened just a fraction, but it was there. A genuine, albeit weak, smile. David and Carol, alerted by Margaret's gasp, arrived in the doorway, their children peering curiously from behind them. They, too, were stunned into silence by the sight before them. The grandchildren, usually so vocal about their love for cats, were speechless, their eyes wide with wonder. The family stood there, united in their astonishment, witnessing a moment that none of them could have predicted. The grumpy grandpa, who had sworn he hated cats, was smiling with an orange cat on his chest. The silence was broken by the quiet chime of a doorbell. It was the doctor for a casual visit. He entered, seeing the scene. Well, this I have to see closer. He approaches, checking George, then looking at Margaret. Any particular reason he's smiling? Margaret pointed at the cat. The doctor was not impressed initially. Okay. Well, if that makes him happy, I am no one to go against it. The doctor examined George. The visit concludes, and as the doctor leaves, he whispers to Margaret, "Keep the cat." The following day, the family waited with bated breath, wondering if the previous afternoon's events had been a fluke, a fleeting moment of anomaly in George's otherwise bleak existence. But as the afternoon sun began to slant through the living room window, a familiar flash of orange appeared on the porch. Sonny, as if on cue, strolled confidently towards the house, his tail held high. He paused at the window, peering inside, his golden eyes searching for George. Margaret, remembering the slightly ajar window from the previous day, made sure it was open wide enough for him to enter. With a graceful leap, Sonny was inside, padding silently towards George's wheelchair. He didn't hesitate, didn't need any encouragement. He jumped onto the armrest, then onto George's lap, settling himself onto his chest with a contented sigh and a rumbling purr. And George again smiled. This time, there was no gasps of surprise, no stunned silence. The family, witnessing the scene for the second time, felt a surge of hope, a sense that something truly remarkable was happening. From that day forward, Sonny's visits became a daily ritual. He would arrive at roughly the same time each afternoon, slip through the open window, and settle himself on George's chest for an hour or so. He'd purr, knead his paws gently, and occasionally lick George's chin with his rough, pink tongue. George, in turn, responded to the cat's presence in ways that amazed and delighted his family. His eyes, once dull and listless, now followed Sonny's movements with a keen interest. He'd make small, guttural sounds, attempts at communication that were clearly directed at the cat. And, most remarkably, he began to try to move his paralyzed left hand, inching it closer and closer to Sonny's soft fur. Margaret encouraged the interaction, seeing the profound impact it was having on George's mood and overall well-being. She'd sit with him during Sonny's visits, talking to him softly, reading aloud from his favorite books, or simply sharing the quiet companionship of the cat. The grandchildren, initially hesitant, began to join in as well. They'd sit on the floor near George's wheelchair, drawing pictures of Sonny, telling stories about their day, and tentatively reaching out to stroke the cat's soft fur. The presence of the cat had somehow bridged the gap created by the stroke, making it easier for them to connect with their grandfather. The atmosphere in the house, once heavy with grief and frustration, began to lighten. There was a sense of purpose, of shared hope, that had been missing since George's stroke. Sonny, the unexpected visitor, had become a furry, four-legged catalyst for healing. Part 7, Whispers and Purrs. As the weeks passed, the bond between George and Sonny deepened. What had begun as a simple act of feline curiosity had blossomed into a profound and unexpected connection. George, the man who had always sworn he hated cats, had found a silent confidant, a furry friend who seemed to understand him in a way that no one else could. One afternoon, as Margaret was preparing tea in the kitchen, she heard a sound that made her stop in her tracks. It was a low, guttural sound, coming from the living room. She cautiously peeked around the corner, her heart pounding with anticipation. George was sitting in his wheelchair, Sonny curled up on his chest as usual. But this time, George wasn't silent. He was making sounds, not just grunts and sighs, but actual words, whispered so softly that they were barely audible. Margaret crept closer, listening intently. She could make out fragments of sentences, broken phrases, whispered confessions. "Always so stubborn," he murmured, his voice raspy and strained. "Never listened." He paused, his hand inching closer to Sonny's fur. "Soft, you're so soft." Margaret realized, with a surge of emotion, that George was talking to the cat. He was sharing his thoughts, his regrets, his fears, with this furry creature who couldn't understand his words but seemed to understand his heart. Sonny, in response, purred louder, nuzzling his head against George's chin. He seemed to be listening intently, his golden eyes fixed on George's face. Over the next few days, Margaret continued to overhear these whispered conversations. George would talk to Sonny about his life, his work as a carpenter, his love for Margaret, his regrets about being so stubborn and set in his ways. He'd even apologize in a halting whisper for all the times he'd yelled at cats. The family, witnessing this remarkable development, was amazed. The speech therapist, who visited George twice a week, was astounded by his progress. She attributed it, in part, to the calming and motivating presence of the cat. One afternoon, during a therapy session, George managed to reach out with his partially paralyzed left hand and stroke Sunny's fur. It was a small movement, a shaky, uncertain gesture, but it was a monumental breakthrough. Tears welled up in Margaret's eyes as she watched, her heart overflowing with gratitude for the orange cat, who had somehow unlocked something within her husband that they had all thought was lost forever. Part 8. The Neighbor's Perspective. The orange cat's daily visits to the Patterson residence hadn't gone unnoticed by the neighbors. Mrs. Eleanor Henderson, a kindly widow in her late 70s, lived next door, in the small, yellow house with the rose bushes climbing the porch. She was Sunny's owner, and she'd been watching the unfolding drama with a mixture of curiosity and quiet amusement. One morning, as Margaret was watering her flowers, Mrs. Henderson strolled over, her garden trowel in hand. "Your husband seems to have made a new friend," she said, her voice a gentle, lilting melody. Margaret smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile that reached her eyes. "He has," she replied. "It's the most amazing thing. He used to hate cats." Mrs. Henderson chuckled, a warm, knowing sound. "Sunny has a way about him," she said. "He's always been a bit of a healer, that one." Margaret invited Mrs. Henderson to sit on the porch swing, and the two women began to chat. Margaret shared the story of George's stroke, his struggles with recovery, and the unexpected bond he had formed with Sunny. Mrs. Henderson listened intently, her eyes filled with compassion. She, in turn, shared stories about Sunny's life. She'd adopted him from a local shelter several years earlier, after her husband had passed away. Sunny had been her constant companion, her source of comfort and joy during a difficult time. "He's always been drawn to people who are hurting," Mrs. Henderson said. "He seems to sense when someone needs him. After my Arthur died, he wouldn't leave my side. He'd just curl up on my lap and purr, as if he knew exactly what I was going through." Margaret nodded, understanding completely. "He's doing the same for George," she said. "He's brought him back to life in a way." The two women sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching Sunny through the living room window, curled up on George's chest. A sense of shared understanding, of neighborly kindness, passed between them. "I'm so grateful to you, Mrs. Henderson," Margaret said, her voice choked with emotion, "for letting Sunny come over. For everything." Mrs. Henderson smiled. "He's a happy cat, Margaret," she said, "and he's doing what he loves to do. That's all that matters." They talked about their community and how much they both loved it. Part 9. Slow but steady progress. The months that followed were marked by slow but steady progress for George. He remained paralyzed on his left side, and his speech was still impaired, but he was a different man than the silent, frustrated figure he had been after the stroke. His daily interactions with Sunny had sparked a renewed interest in life. He was more engaged with his surroundings, more responsive to his family, and more determined to participate in his therapy. He worked diligently with his physical therapist, pushing himself to regain strength and mobility. He practiced his speech exercises, his whispered words gradually becoming clearer and more coherent. And every afternoon, he waited eagerly for Sunny's arrival, his eyes lighting up when he saw the familiar flash of orange fur. The family dynamic, too, had undergone a transformation. The initial awkwardness and uncertainty had dissipated, replaced by a renewed sense of closeness and understanding. The grandchildren, no longer hesitant, would spend hours with George and Sunny, reading stories, drawing pictures, and simply enjoying their grandfather's company. David and Carol, witnessing their father's remarkable progress, felt a sense of relief and gratitude. They had feared they had lost the man he once was, but Sunny had somehow helped him find his way back. Margaret, the unwavering anchor of the family, watched it all with a quiet joy. She had never given up hope, even in the darkest days, and now, seeing her husband smile again, hearing him speak again, feeling his love again, she knew that her faith had been rewarded. Sunny continued to be a constant, comforting presence in George's life. He was more than just a cat. He was a friend, a confidant, a furry therapist who had helped a grumpy old man rediscover the joy of living. He was family. Part 10, Acceptance and Love. A year had passed since George's stroke. He was still living with its effects, still confined to a wheelchair, still struggling with his speech. But he was also living a full and meaningful life, surrounded by the love of his family and the unwavering companionship of a certain orange cat. He had accepted his limitations, but he had also found a new appreciation for the simple things. The warmth of the sun on his face, the laughter of his grandchildren, the soft purr of Sunny on his lap. He had learned that even in the face of adversity, there was always the possibility of finding joy, connection, and healing. One sunny afternoon, George was sitting in his wheelchair on the porch, Sunny curled up on his lap, basking in the warm Arizona sunshine. His family was gathered around him. Margaret, David and his wife, Carol and her husband, and all 4 grandchildren. The grandchildren were playing a game, their laughter echoing through the yard. Margaret was reading a book, her hand resting gently on George's arm. David and Carol were chatting quietly, their voices a comforting murmur in the background. George looked around at his family, his heart swelling with love. He had come so far, overcome so much. He had faced his mortality, wrestled with his demons, and emerged, not unscathed, but stronger, wiser, and more appreciative of the precious gift of life. He reached down and stroked Sunny's soft fur, feeling the familiar rumble of his purr. He smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile that lit up his face. "Good kitty," he whispered, his voice still raspy but clear enough to be understood. The grandchildren, hearing his voice, stopped their game and ran over to him, showering him with hugs and kisses. Margaret leaned over and kissed his cheek, her eyes filled with tears of joy. George looked at them, at his loving family, at the loyal cat on his lap, at the warm sun shining down on him, and he knew that he was blessed. He had found acceptance, he had found peace, and he had found love in the most unexpected of places. The cat-hating grandpa was a distant memory, a ghost of the past. In its place was a man who had learned, through hardship and the unexpected companionship of an orange cat, the true meaning of life, love, and family. He had learned at last to love a cat.
The nursing home took in a stray cat, not realizing he had a special purpose for the dying. The first blush of dawn hadn't yet fully broken the grip of the Pennsylvania night, but a pale, watery light seeped through the large windows of Maple Creek Senior Living. It was the kind of light that promised a chilly autumn day, painting the dew-kissed lawns outside in shades of silver and gray. Inside, the building hummed with the low, expectant thrum of impending wakefulness, the distant whir of a floor polisher, the soft click of a thermostat kicking in, the almost imperceptible sigh of an old building settling, and amidst these sounds, another presence stirred. Charlie, a ginger cat of considerable heft and indeterminate origin, uncurled himself from the worn armchair in the main lounge. He stretched, first one front leg, then the other, claws extending briefly into the faded floral upholstery before retracting. His movements were slow, deliberate, carrying the stiffness of his 12 odd years. His fur, once a vibrant marmalade, was now muted, flecked with white around his muzzle and ears, testament to a life lived wandering before finding this unlikely sanctuary. No one at Maple Creek could quite recall Charlie's arrival with perfect clarity. It was sometime 5, maybe 6 years ago. He'd simply appeared one rainy afternoon, a drenched and slightly scruffy figure huddled by the automatic glass doors, looking utterly pathetic and yet strangely resolute. Initial attempts to shoo him away or calls to the local animal shelter proved fruitless. He'd vanish when approached directly, only to reappear moments later, a silent, furry sentinel. Eventually, Agnes, the head nurse with a soft spot hidden beneath a starched exterior, had put down a saucer of milk. From then on, Charlie was simply there. He wasn't officially adopted, held no paperwork, yet he navigated the halls and rooms of Maple Creek with the quiet entitlement of a long-term resident. He was a furry ghost, a silent confidant, a warm weight on cold laps. His first task of the morning, undertaken with the solemnity of ritual, was to visit Mrs. Ruth Abernathy in room 21B. Charlie padded down the softly lit corridor, his paws making no sound on the industrial-grade carpet. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic, lavender room spray, and something older, harder to define, the scent of time itself, perhaps. He paused outside Mrs. Ruth's door, listening. He could hear the faint, rhythmic rasp of her breathing, slightly labored, but steady. He nudged the door gently with his head. It was always left slightly ajar for him. Inside, the room was dim, dominated by a hospital-style bed cranked up slightly at the head. Beside it stood a small table cluttered with photographs in tarnished silver frames, black and white images of a young woman with bright eyes standing beside a smiling soldier, color photos of children growing into adults, then grandchildren beaming from school portraits. These were the anchors of a life slipping through the sieve of memory. Mrs. Ruth was awake, her eyes open but unfocused, gazing towards the window where the dawn was slowly painting the sky. She was a small woman, lost amidst the pillows and blankets, her white hair spread like fine silk against the cotton casing. She had been an elementary school teacher for over 40 years, shaping generations of young minds in the nearby town. Now, her own mind often wandered, looping back through decades, mistaking nurses for former students, snippets of lessons mingling with fragments of yesterday's lunch conversation. Charlie let out a soft, questioning chirp, barely more than a puff of air. Mrs. Ruth's head turned slowly towards the sound. A flicker of recognition, faint but definite, crossed her face. "Oh, it's you, Marmalade," she whispered. She sometimes called him Marmalade, sometimes Sonny, sometimes just Kitty. Charlie didn't mind. He understood the intention, if not the name. With a grunt of effort that spoke of his aging joints, he leaped onto the foot of the bed. It was a familiar journey, yet each time it felt a little harder. He walked carefully up the incline of her blanket-covered legs, his weight a comforting pressure. He settled beside her hip, tucking his paws beneath his chest and beginning to purr, a deep rumble that vibrated through the mattress. Mrs. Ruth's hand, thin and papery, veins standing out like blue rivers beneath translucent skin, reached out tentatively. Her fingers found his fur, stroking him with a touch that was feather-light, yet grounded in an instinct older than her failing memory. "Such a good boy," she murmured, her gaze still distant. "Always coming to see me." She paused, her brow furrowing slightly. Did the children finish their spelling tests? Charlie just purred louder, nudging his head gently against her hand. He didn't need to understand the words. He understood the tremor in her voice, the loneliness that sometimes swam in her eyes, even when surrounded by people. He was a stable point in her fluctuating reality, a warm, living presence that demanded nothing but offered solace. For a long while, They stayed like that. The room grew brighter as the sun climbed higher, dust motes dancing in the beams, slanting through the window. Outside, the sounds of the nursing home waking up grew louder. The clatter of breakfast trolleys, the cheerful greetings of the morning shift nurses, the distant ring of a telephone. Mrs. Ruth continued to talk, her voice soft, drifting between decades. She spoke of lesson plans for long-graduated students, of her late husband George, who had loved gardening, of a yellow dress she wore to a dance in 1958. Charlie listened, his eyes half closed, the rhythmic stroke of her hand a comforting metronome. He absorbed the words, the emotions woven into them, whispers of joy, pangs of loss, the pervasive fog of confusion. He offered no answers, no judgments, just the steady anchor of his presence. He felt the subtle shift in her breathing, the slight slackening of her hand against his fur as she drifted into a light doze. Her mind, for a moment, had found a peaceful harbor. This was his cue. Gently, carefully, so as not to disturb her fragile rest, Charlie extracted himself. He hopped down from the bed, landing with a soft thud on the carpeted floor. He gave one last look at the small figure nestled in the bed, the morning sun catching the silver in her hair, then turned and padded silently out of the room. The hallway was busier now. A nurse, Maria, young and energetic with bright pink scrubs, smiled as she saw him. "Morning, Charlie. Making your rounds?" she whispered, careful not to wake any residents whose doors were still closed. Charlie acknowledged her with a slow blink before continuing his patrol. He wasn't just a pet. He was part of the rhythm of Maple Creek, a furry cog in the complex machinery of care and companionship. His quiet presence was woven into the fabric of countless ordinary days, making them, for the people who lived here, a little less ordinary, a little less lonely. His work for the morning wasn't done yet. There were other rooms to visit, other quiet souls waiting for a moment of uncomplicated warmth. Mr. Henry, in 34A, would be expecting him by the window soon. Charlie headed towards the elevator, the scent of brewing coffee now mingling with the antiseptic air, pulling him towards the next chapter of his long, quiet day. Leaving the hushed quiet of Mrs. Ruth's room was like stepping back into a gently flowing river. The main corridor of Maple Creek hummed with the established rhythm of late morning. The breakfast trolleys had completed their rounds, leaving behind the lingering aroma of coffee, toast, and oatmeal. Residents, dressed for the day, moved slowly along the hallways, some aided by walkers that glinted under the fluorescent lights, others leaning on the arms of nurses or family members who had arrived for early visits. Charlie navigated the foot traffic with practiced ease. He flowed around ankles and wheels, a silent orange eddy in the slow-moving current. He ignored the well-meaning coos of Mrs. Gable from room 18, who always tried to lure him with promises of treats he knew she didn't have, and sidestepped the outstretched hand of Mr. Henderson, whose playful grabs were becoming increasingly shaky. He acknowledged Nurse Maria again with a flick of his tail as she hurried past with a clipboard, her brow furrowed in concentration. His destination was the third floor, room 34A, the domain of Mr. Henry Peterson. Charlie rarely bothered with the elevator, preferring the back stairwell typically used by staff. The climb was getting harder, each step a conscious effort for his 12-year-old frame, but the quiet and solitude of the concrete stairs were preferable to the unpredictable stops and starts of the lift. He took his time, pausing on the landings to catch his breath, the only sound the faint echo of his own soft panting. He emerged onto the third-floor corridor, which felt slightly calmer than the floor below. Fewer residents resided here, mostly those needing a bit more quiet or space. He padded towards 34A, the scent of lemon oil polish. Mr. Henry was meticulous, faintly discernible even from the hallway. The door was slightly ajar, just as Mrs. Ruth's had been. Charlie nudged it open and slipped inside. Mr. Henry's room was different from Mrs. Ruth's. Where hers was filled with the soft clutter of memories and photographs, his was a study in order and quiet observation. The bed was neatly made, the surfaces clear except for a well-worn Bible, a pair of reading glasses, and a single framed photograph of a smiling woman with kind eyes, his late wife, Eleanor. The room's focal point was the large window overlooking the nursing home's modest garden. And there, seated in a sturdy armchair, positioned to maximize the view, was Mr. Henry. He was a tall man, even seated, though age had stooped his broad shoulders. His hands, large and knuckled, rested on the arms of the chair. These were hands that had spent a lifetime shaping wood, hands that understood the grain, the weight, the potential of oak and pine and maple. He had been a carpenter, a cabinet maker, renowned in the county for his skill and honesty. Now, those hands were mostly still, marked by age spots and the slight tremor of Parkinson's that frustrated him more than he ever let on. Mr. Henry didn't turn as Charlie entered. He didn't need to. He knew the soft pad of the cat's paws, the specific weight and timing of his arrival. Charlie hopped onto the wide windowsill beside the armchair, a space kept clear specifically for him. He settled down, tucking his paws neatly, and joined Mr. Henry in gazing out at the garden. It wasn't a grand garden. A few resilient rose bushes clung to their last blooms, their colors faded but defiant against the encroaching chill. Maple trees, their leaves turning brilliant shades of scarlet and gold, framed a small patch of lawn where a bird bath stood empty, waiting for warmer days. Fallen leaves skittered across the grass in the strengthening autumn wind. Unlike Mrs. Ruth, Mr. Henry rarely spoke to Charlie, not in rambling sentences anyway. Their communion was one of shared silence, mutual presence. Charlie felt the man's stillness, a deep, contemplative quiet that seemed to absorb the sounds from the hallway, leaving only the rustle of leaves outside and the steady ticking of the small clock on the bedside table. "Wind's picking up," Mr. Henry murmured finally, his voice raspy but clear. "Might bring rain later." Charlie flicked an ear in acknowledgement, his gaze fixed on a squirrel darting along a branch of the nearest maple. Mr. Henry sighed, a soft sound, less of sadness and more of resignation. "Leaves are turning fast this year. Seems like just yesterday they were green." He traced a pattern on the arm of the chair with one finger, a gesture Charlie recognized. He often did that when lost in thought, perhaps mapping the grain of phantom wood, remembering the feel of his tools. Charlie knew, in the way animals sense unspoken things, that Mr. Henry's quietness held its own weight of memory, just as Mrs. Ruth's words did. He could feel the man's longing for the scent of sawdust, for the satisfying ache in his muscles after a long day in the workshop. for the easy companionship of Eleanor, who had understood his need for quiet spaces. Here, surrounded by the necessary routines and well-meaning chatter of Maple Creek, that deep quiet was harder to find, except perhaps here by the window, with an old cat who asked for nothing. They watched as a gust of wind sent a shower of golden leaves swirling down from the maple tree. It was beautiful in a melancholic way, the inevitable letting go, the preparation for winter's dormancy. Charlie felt a faint tension in Mr. Henry's stillness, saw the slight tightening of his grip on the chair's arm. Perhaps the falling leaves reminded him not just of the changing season, but of other losses, other things slipping away. Strength, certainty, time. A nurse, younger, one Charlie didn't know as well, bustled in, carrying a small paper cup with pills. "Time for your midday medication, Mr. Peterson." Her voice was bright, a little too loud for the quiet room. Mr. Henry took the cup without looking away from the window. "Thank you, dear." The nurse glanced at Charlie on the windowsill. "Oh, look who's here, keeping Mr. Peterson company." She reached out a hesitant hand, then seemed to think better of it. Charlie ignored her, his focus still outside. He wasn't hostile, just uninterested in casual interruption. Satisfied her task was done, the nurse bustled out, leaving the quiet to settle back into place. Mr. Henry swallowed his pills with a sip of water from the glass beside him. He made a small, involuntary grimace. "Harder to get things down these days," he said, more to himself than to Charlie. Charlie shifted slightly, rubbing his head against the cool window pane. He could feel the vibrations of the wind against the glass. He stayed there, a warm, purring fixture on the sill, long after the sun had reached its zenith. He watched the shadows shorten and then begin to lengthen again across the lawn. He listened to Mr. Henry's steady, quiet breathing, occasionally punctuated by a sigh or a softly muttered observation about the weather or a bird landing on the bath. Sometimes Mr. Henry would reach over and gently stroke Charlie's back, his touch surprisingly firm despite the tremor. Charlie would lean into the touch, purring a little louder, acknowledging the connection. It was a simple exchange, devoid of complex demands, yet deeply felt. In the quiet room, with the autumn wind whispering outside, the old carpenter and the old cat shared a moment of stillness, watching the world turn, accepting the slow fade of the season together. As the scent of lunch, baked chicken, and overcooked vegetables began to drift down the hallway, Charlie knew his time here was drawing to a close for now. He gave a final nudge against the window pane, stretched deliberately, and hopped down. He glanced back at Mr. Henry, who offered a slight nod, his gaze already returned to the garden. Charlie padded out, leaving the man to his thoughts and the falling leaves, ready to see where the afternoon currents of Maple Creek would take him next. The scent of baked fish and lemon wedges faded, replaced by the faint, clean aroma of floor cleaner, as the evening cleaning crew began their methodical work in the common areas. Dinner was over. The clatter from the dining room subsided, replaced by the softer sounds of evening. The low murmur of televisions drifting from behind closed doors, the occasional call bell summoning a nurse, the gentle squeak of medication carts making their final rounds. The bright overhead lights in the corridors dimmed, casting the hallways in a softer, more intimate glow. Maple Creek was settling into the long quiet of the night. Charlie felt the shift in the building's rhythm. The gentle bustle of the day was giving way to a deeper stillness, punctuated by the specific sounds and routines of the night shift. He saw Nurse Agnes, the head nurse whose shift was ending, conferring quietly with David, a calm, steady presence who handled many of the night duties. Agnes gave Charlie a tired smile and a quick scratch behind the ears as she passed him on her way out. "Keep an eye on things, Charlie," she murmured, a ritual phrase between them. Charlie responded with a slow blink, accepting the responsibility. He knew his own work wasn't quite finished. He had his final checks to make, brief visits to anchor the end of the day. He padded silently back towards the second floor, towards room 21B. Peeking inside Mrs. Ruth's room, he saw her small form curled under the blankets, bathed in the soft glow of a nightlight shaped like a seashell. Her breathing was slow and even. She seemed peaceful, lost in whatever landscape her dreams offered tonight. He didn't go in, content to observe from the doorway, a silent guardian checking his post. Satisfied, he turned away. Next, he ascended the now familiar back stairs to the third floor. The climb felt heavier now, the day's accumulated fatigue settling into his joints. He pushed open the door to Mr. Henry's room, 34A. The only light came from the window, reflecting the distant orange glow of streetlights onto the ceiling. Mr. Henry sat in his usual chair, but he wasn't looking out at the darkened garden. Instead, he had his well-worn Bible open on his lap, though Charlie suspected he wasn't actively reading in the dim light. Perhaps just holding it, feeling the familiar weight, was comfort enough. Charlie let out a soft chirp. Mr. Henry looked over, his silhouette framed against the window. "Evening, Charlie," he said quietly. "Come to say good night?" Charlie walked over and rubbed against the leg of the chair, a brief gesture of connection. "Mr." Henry reached down, his hand finding Charlie's back in the near darkness, stroking his fur a few times. The tremor in his hand seemed more pronounced in the quiet of the evening. "Another day gone," Mr. Henry sighed. "They go faster now, you know." Charlie offered no reply, but leaned into the touch for a moment longer before stepping back. He looked toward the window, then back at Mr. Henry, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. He then turned and padded out, leaving the old carpenter to his thoughts and the approaching night. As he walked back along the third-floor corridor, he passed room 31B. The door was closed, and the small nameplate beside it was blank. Until last week, it had belonged to Mrs. Esther Klein, a woman who loved telling stories about her days as a hat maker in Philadelphia, and who always saved a bit of tuna from her lunch for Charlie, sneaking it to him against the rules. Now, the room was empty, silent, waiting for its next occupant. Charlie paused by the door, sniffing at the crack underneath. The faint scent of Mrs. Klein's rosewater perfume was already fading, overlaid by the sharp smell of disinfectant used to clean the room after her passing. It was a familiar transition at Maple Creek, this quiet erasing of one life to make space for another. Charlie felt no complex grief, perhaps, but an animal's recognition of absence, a disruption in the familiar pattern. He lingered a moment longer, then moved on. Downstairs, the main lounge was deserted now, the chairs and sofas standing like silent shadow beasts. The television was off. Charlie considered the worn armchair where he'd started the day, but tonight he felt drawn to a different spot. He made his way to a familiar alcove in the main second-floor corridor, near Mrs. Ruth's room, but slightly recessed, offering a view in both directions. Here, a small cushioned bench sat against the wall, intended for visitors needing a brief rest. Underneath this bench was Charlie's preferred nighttime spot. He circled once, twice, before settling down, tucking his paws and tail neatly beneath him. The carpet here was thin, but it was out of the main path of any late-night foot traffic, and it offered a sense of security. From here, he could hear the subtle symphony of the sleeping building, the gentle hum of the ventilation system, the distant gurgle of pipes, the creak of the building settling. More importantly, he could hear the soft, rhythmic breathing emanating from the nearby rooms, the gentle sighs, the occasional snore, the quiet inhalations and exhalations of people who had lived long lives, filled with loves and losses, joys and sorrows, hopes realized and hopes deferred. He closed his eyes, letting the sounds wash over him. He wasn't thinking about Mrs. Ruth's fragmented memories or Mr. Henry's quiet resignation or the emptiness of room 31B. His world was simpler, more immediate, the warmth radiating from his own body, the familiar sense of the hallway, the deep, instinctual comfort of routine and place. Yet, his presence there, a small, warm knot of life in the quiet corridor, was its own kind of anchor. He was a silent witness to the vulnerability of sleep, a furry sentinel keeping watch over these twilight years. There was no grand revelation, no dramatic event to mark the end of this day. It was simply another cycle completed. The sun had risen, moved across the sky, and set. Residents had woken, eaten, talked, remembered, forgotten, slept. Charlie had moved among them, offering his silent companionship, absorbing their unspoken needs, sharing their quiet moments. Outside, the autumn wind whispered around the corners of Maple Creek, carrying the scent of rain predicted by Mr. Henry. Inside, the building breathed softly around Charlie. He drifted into a light, watchful doze, his ginger fur blending into the shadows beneath the bench. Tomorrow, the pale dawn would seep through the windows again. The breakfast trolley would rattle, the nurses would change shifts, and Charlie, the old ginger cat of indeterminate origin, would stretch his stiff limbs and begin his rounds once more. Just another long day, woven into the quiet tapestry of life and time at Maple Creek Senior Living. A day made fractionally warmer, fractionally less lonely, by the steady, purring presence of a silent friend.